Festival 2023, protected by Dettol, Swasth Banega India at Charbagh. We are delighted to introduce Negotiating the New Normal, Saurav Jha in conversation with Eswar Prasad, and the book launched by Shashi Tharoor. In Negotiating the New Normal, Saurav Jha clinically examines why, in the wake of coronavirus shock, strong economic recovery and in the developed world is more doubtful than ever. Instead of throwing its weight behind a multipolar world order, China, by far the largest economy amongst the BRICS nations, has chosen to create a Pax Seneca. However, it's unlikely to make much headway owing to both internal economic contradictions and pushback from the West and beyond. Headway owing to both, and what about India? Can it become new China to serve as a key engine of global growth, overcoming the pandemic-induced setback, as well as the earlier policy mistakes like demonetization? Answering all these questions and raising many more, Jha's deeply researched and cogently argued account examines the new normal of a transactional, even predatory geo-economic climate. Saurav Jha is a geostrategic affairs expert and director of Delhi Defense Review, a think tank focused on the analysis of technology, war, and ideas. Trained in economics at Presidency College, Calcutta, and Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, Jha has worked as an energy economist in the past, besides serving as a consultant to FICCI's international division. His first book, The Upside-Down Book of Nuclear Power, was released in 2010 and is being used by India's Department of Atomic Energy as a nuclear awareness building read. In 2015, he published The Heat and Dust project, co-written with Devapriya Roy, which chronicles a backpacking trip through India on an extremely tight budget. Eswar Prasad is a professor at Cornell University, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a former head of IMF China division. His latest book, The Future of Money, How the Digital Revolution is Transforming Currencies and Finance, was listed among the best economic books of 2021 by the Financial Times and The Economist. Shashi Tharoor, a third-term member of parliament from Thiruvananthapuram, is the best-selling author of 24 books, both fiction and non-fiction, besides being a former Undersecretary General of United Nations and former Minister of State for Human Resources Development and for External Affairs in the Government of India. He has won numerous awards, including the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019. Dr. Tharoor was also awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in the category of English non-fiction for his book, An Era of Darkness. He has previously chaired the Standing Committee on External Affairs and the Committee on Information Technology. We are delighted to have all three gentlemen here. Please give them a big hand.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Tharoor and Saurav, for giving us this opportunity to get together. So India is at a pivotal moment in terms of its economic transformation, and of course the COVID crisis put a dent in the growth rate of many economies around the world, but it was also an opportunity to push forward with reforms and try to think about the next few years ahead. What sort of policies, what sort of frameworks might be necessary to put India on a growth path that could make it achieve its potential. So Saurav has written a very interesting book, and before we talk about that, we're going to have the privilege of having Dr. Tharoor unveil the book and say a few words about it. Dr. Tharoor.
I'm just going to say a few words about this rather wonderful book.
Sorry.
That's okay, I should sing now instead of speak.
Yes.
Before I leave the stage to these two very well-qualified gentlemen. Just to say that I've actually, I hadn't read Saurav Jha's very first book on nuclear policy, but his second, written with his very talented wife, Devapriya Roy, was an amazing work, the Heat and Dust Project, about traveling on the cheap throughout India by bus and train and on foot and other means of transport. And his discovery of India through that was such a delight that I wondered what the new book would hold. Well, the new book is very, very different. And it is a book about essentially what's called world order studies. I mean, what is the world going to be like? How is it ordered? And how might it be in the years ahead, in the proximate future? And I think if you look at that, it's very striking. I mean, I was particularly interested because some years ago, more than 10 years ago, and I published a book called Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century, which was about India and its place in the world. And what Saurav has done is written about the world and India's place in it, which is kind of an inversion, really, in many ways of the way in which we in this country habitually look at issues of foreign policy. What I found very interesting also is that he is something I absolutely am not, which is he understands economics, and he has merged, if you like, a geo-economic perspective on both domestic and foreign issues with the geostrategic strategic concerns that animate his overall work. We're looking at a very interesting period in our history. I'm somewhat proud of having coined the term multi-alignment way back in 2007 when I came back to India and entered Indian politics from the UN. And when I tried to use it as minister a couple of years later, it sank without trace. Nobody in our establishment liked the notion. We were still firmly wedded, at least rhetorically, to the notion of non-alignment. But increasingly, though, it has become really characteristic of the way in which we relate to the world. The world itself and all international relations have become much more like the internet, the World Wide Web. We're all networked, we're all connected to each other, but in different ways and patterns. So one country may be connected to A, may be connected to B, and B may be connected to C, but A may have nothing to do with C of any serious nature. And so these different connections make it difficult to think of aligning along the binary terms we're used to in the days of the Cold War. Even though today there is a real danger of the emergence of what Hillary Clinton dubbed the G2, that is the US and China, as the two new superpowers who, at a certain time it was feared, and certainly feared by people like me when I wrote Pax Indica, would try and divide up the world into their respective spheres of influence, leaving the rest of us no room to maneuver. Well, fortunately for us, in my view, and perhaps unfortunately for the world as a whole, they didn't do that. They ended up instead becoming serious rivals to each other. And instead of a G2 condominium that might actually run the world, you've got the US and China at loggerheads, but again, now obliging many countries to make a choice as to which side they would find themselves, the same binary option as before. So these are complicated and interesting times, and negotiating the new normal is precisely about how you negotiate your way forward, in this case, how we in India should negotiate our way forward. Saurav wisely also talks about domestic issues in India, which will help determine the kind of India that is to negotiate its place in a post-pandemic world. And he's in very good hands with Professor Eswar Prasad, who is both a policy thinker and a teacher, and I'm sure can take you both forward in an interesting direction. I just wanted to say to all of you how pleased I am to offer my congratulations to Saurav for having written this book, to wish it all success, and to wish you both a marvelous conversation at JLF. Good luck and congratulations, Saurav.
Well, Dr. Tharoor, good ideas and good phrases take a while to mature, and multi-alignment certainly seems to be coming into vogue. But thank you very much for
Actually, you know, Mr. Jaishankar has started using it. And
Indeed.
What was interesting is the first time he did so at the Resina Dialogue a couple of years ago, he was gracious enough to credit me with it, since I was sitting in the audience. Perhaps he felt he should. And it's now slipping into fairly regular usage, which I think is not a bad thing because it really is a better explanation of our current posture, which may well be our posture for some time to come and will be congruent with what Saurav seems to be recommending, than other formulations. Because non-alignment always had a slightly negative quality to it as a term, but we would always say that, after all, non-violence and non-cooperation were given a strongly positive content during the freedom movement, so why not non-alignment afterwards?
Yeah,
but I think it's nice to have a
on
more
its own
positive
terms. I think is exactly the right way to think about it. So more power to you and your
Thank
ideas.
you. Nice
Thank
to
you
see
so much,
Eswar.
and thank you for gracing
all the best,
us with your
Saurav,
presence.
and all the best to all of you for a very good discussion.
Thank you so much. All right, Saurav. So that was a good start to a discussion of your book. And what is interesting about Saurav's... oh, okay. Okay. So the interesting thing about Saurav's book, as Dr. Tharoor pointed out, is that it very nicely blends economics and geopolitics. And indeed, it is a book that covers a vast amount of ground, talking about how different countries and different regions of the world, from the US to the Eurozone and Europe more broadly and Japan, fit into the world economic order and also the world geopolitical order. And one thing we are seeing in the last couple of years in particular, but over the last decade really, is how these two forces, the economic and geopolitical forces, tend to get very closely aligned and sometimes trip over each other. So Saurav's book gives us a very nice tour through these very complicated subjects, and I do recommend it as reading for those of you who want to understand better the dynamics at play both on the economic and geopolitical sides. But in writing a book, Saurav, there is always a force that impels an author, that there is something important that has to be said. What is it that drove you to write the book?
Yeah, you see, this book, I think, has been germinating inside for a very long time. Probably from the years when I first was a student of economics, back in the day in Presidency. And as you mentioned, I always thought that the treatment of large affairs, as Dr. Tharoor said, it's a book about the world order. Treatment of large affairs never really lends itself to a sort of a segmented approach. The geoeconomic and the geopolitical aspects invariably interact with each other. And perhaps where things are headed would be better understood if we looked at it from that perspective. Of course, I'm doing something that is academically sacrilegious, perhaps, in certain places, but I always felt that if we had to do the art of the possible, we had to look at these together. So this book was germinating inside me for a very long time. So because as a student of economics, when I was a student of economics, there was always this tension between macro and micro, right? And I felt that sort of partition too isn't watertight per se. So that is the initial impetus. But then any book, is ultimately comes from inside, as you pointed out. And it took me a while to write it. I spent 6 years writing it, went through 2.5 drafts. So it was a tortuous process. So more than the impelling, it later became about the dispelling, I had to sort of stop, because otherwise I would have lost a lot in the process. Especially my publisher's well-being, I think, goodwill.
That's true. The book does cover a great deal of ground, and I can see her to make some very difficult strategic choices about what you would include and what you would not include in the book. But it does have a nice narrative thread to it, trying to think about what central banks have been doing, what fiscal authorities have been doing, how that plays into the international monetary system. And then you talk about the interplay of relationships among the different economic and geopolitical blocs. Now, clearly there are lots of people here interested in your book, but what would you say is the big driving thesis of your book? What do you want our audience to take away if they read your book, which I hope they will?
Yeah, so it's about, it's what we are really looking at is that the world is, our policy is multi-alignment, as Dr. Tharoor had coined the term, and it's good that Dr. Jaishankar sort of gave him credit for it. The basic thesis here is that we have entered a new phase in the world order. This is a world that is far more transactional and far more predatory than earlier. The earlier Washington consensus neoliberal world has now frayed almost completely. And the major US-China decoupling has taken place. There's intense strategic competition between the United States and China, both on the geoeconomic front and geopolitical fronts. And but what that does is it creates a window of opportunity for actual multipolarity to emerge. And there is actually no need for the world to fall back into that old US-USSR paradigm, with this time it being the US and the PRC being the sort of dyad. So there's a window of opportunity for actual multipolarity to emerge. The West still has enough incumbency to check the pace at which that new world order emerges, but it will emerge, right? And therein lies the opportunity for India. India need not take sides or take all sides, really. As multi-alignment goes, that is also a strategy that India can sort of employ, and is employing, in my view. But India has to get its own house in order to take this window of opportunity that has presented itself. So that is the basic point of the book. But it goes through the 4 major economic blocks of the world before it comes to India. Because it's only when you understand what is happening in those places that you will be able to understand what India's opportunities and threats are.
Okay, so those are good themes to pick up on, where India's role is and what India could do constructively in order to engage with the international community on its own terms, but also to think about how it could drive the agenda. And this is a very important year for India because, after all, India has the presidency of the G20, and it's a good time not only to shape the agenda, but also to put on the table many issues that I think may not have been paid much attention to by the advanced economies in particular. So as you think about the configuration of the world economy, and maybe we can start with the economics and then delve into the geopolitics a bit more. So we see the advanced economies on one side, and particularly given that your book focuses on central banking, we have the Fed, the Bank of Japan, and the European Central Bank that seem to be doing their own thing. What they do does have effects on the emerging market economies, India included. And then the emerging market economies have a different set of concerns about exchange rate and capital flow, volatility, and so on. So if you were giving advice to the finance minister or Mr. Modi about what the right way to define India's role should be in this area where clearly there is a conflict of interest between the two groups, how would you frame it?
Well, for one, I would say that as far as central banking is concerned and international capital flows, which are extremely destabilizing now, we will have to adopt a conservative approach, which means we cannot remove capital controls just like that. The RBI sort of says that this is its view, that capital account convertibility is a process rather than a one-off event. So I guess that process will have to be delayed a little bit as India builds its strength. The reason why, with this year of G20 and India can sort of posit itself as a voice for the global south is because it has created certain heft. It has created certain capabilities. It has a certain economic size. It's the 5th largest economy in nominal GDP dollar terms, 3rd largest in purchasing power parity terms, so on and so forth. Of course, a lot more needs to be done because we are still at around 2,500 per capita income nominal. So we are still a lower middle income country in that respect. and we need to move forward. So growth has to be our agenda. Whatever it is that enables growth, but growth in such a way that is not what is called immerserizing, you know. It just breeds more inequality, or it leads to a more lopsided economy. Here lie the opportunities for us. The talk after, after liberalization in India was, oh, we've leapfrogged from agriculture from an agrarian society to a services-based economy. So it's obviously services account for the majority of our GDP, but that doesn't really mean much. It could well mean that you end up with a semi-urbanized feudal kind of an economy where some people are well integrated with the global economy, say the IT-enabled sectors, etc., while the others are in neo-servitude, essentially. They are working as domestic help, or they are working, they are working as security guards, etc., without much agency and without being in greatly productive jobs. So we have to give a push to manufacturing, which is the avowed policy of the current government as well. But how do you give that push? That push requires you to focus at a granular level, and here the learnings from the East Asian industrializers is very important. The learnings from Japan, the learnings from Korea, the learnings from China, how they went about it. They had a granular approach, how they ensured industry-academia collaboration. How is it that they sort of ensured technology diffusion in that industry? So that is where, what I'm trying to say is, India has to build its own sinews. Today's world, the multipolar world of today and tomorrow, will be a world where it will be all about what you bring to the table as a country. What is it that you bring? Today, at the G20, India brings a certain kind of capability of innovating at scale in the IT sector, in the diffusion of various technologies, the so-called India stack, which can possibly be universalized and exported to Africa and Latin America as well. So it's all about what you bring to the table. You have a large market, but it's also about your productive capability. The missing piece of the puzzle for India has been manufacturing. If we do not want to end up in what is called the middle income trap, we need the value multiplier that manufacturing provides. And the current world order provides us with an opening in a very, very long time, because the US-China sort of coupling, which underpinned the entire neoliberal era, is now definitely decoupling. So there is a confluence of factors which can allow us to sort of move into becoming a serious manufacturing power, have now come to pass. They are extant at the moment, and that window has to be taken. That would be my advice.
So it is true that, as you point out, there is a window of opportunity for India. India did undertake this transition from an economy that was largely driven by the primary sector to one being driven by services sector, and it completely missed the middle part of that transition. And one might argue that that was a good thing, but in my view, and I think you seem to share that, it was not necessarily a good thing, because unless you have a dynamic middle class with access to high-wage jobs in a fast-growing manufacturing sector, it's really difficult for a country to make the leap towards being an upper or even middle-income country. So if you think about the Indian landscape right now, there is a lot of excitement around the world about India's growth prospects. India did relatively well, comparatively speaking, during the COVID pandemic. And indeed, in the last few years, India seems to have done quite a bit in terms of reform. So there's been a long reform agenda that you, I, and many others have written about. But there has been progress. When you think about labor laws, there has been some relaxation. There is more of a focus on infrastructure spending, both physical and soft. The GST, I think, is a move towards a better tax system. There have been some restraints on FDI lifted. So all of this is going in the right direction. But what are the big steps that you think need to be undertaken still to solidify this manufacturing revolution and make sure that India doesn't miss this window of opportunity?
So, see, as you pointed out, that certain reforms have been undertaken, and probably India's labor code will become similar to that of Vietnam, which is the other sort of entity that is trying to leapfrog and use it. But Vietnam just doesn't have the scale that India can provide. So China plus one cannot just be Vietnam and Mexico. So the point is that what India has to do is it has to understand the importance of the supply chain. the big trend of this, one of the big trends of the current economic sort of sphere landscape is something that was there, that was underway even prior to the pandemic. If anything, the pandemic has only accelerated the process, right? In the sense that, just-in-time manufacturing philosophy is giving a way to just-in-case manufacturing philosophy again, where maintaining larger inventories, where having shorter supply chains, etc., are now not issues that are simply up in the air. They're actually being implemented. So the thing is that the regionalization of manufacturing value chains is one of the great realities of the world today. Earlier, you had made in the world, right? In the last 20 years, the paradigm was made in the world. You talked about how a semiconductor chip traversed borders 2,500 times, manner of speaking, maybe a little less in that sense, but before it actually ended up in some system, right, or on some platform. But the world is no longer so various groups across the world are no longer so comfortable with that anymore. They want much shorter supply chains. Even from a neoliberal perspective, the case for having knowledge development centers and R&D centers and manufacturing, co-locating the two, is quite good, even from an earlier neoclassical kind of perspective. But once you take into account things like resilience, dependency, the fact that, yes, I have the world's most efficient supply chain, but tomorrow there's a war in the South China Sea, and my supply chain comes to naught because nothing is supplied in the first place. So there are very real costs associated with, disruption. So that we need to inculcate. So we need to have our own domestic supply chain. For that supply chain, we obviously need to focus on micro, small, and medium enterprises, right? Because that is one of the things that's just thrown out there as confetti, but not enough is done over there. And MSMEs, developing MSMEs is a key constituent of any industrial estate, by having proper technologically capable MSMEs. I'll just give a small illustrative example. So I bought this last winter, I bought a blow heater, okay, from an Indian company, Indian manufacturer, Ovastar. There was an issue with the blow heater, so the company sent a representative. He opened the thing up and I started talking with him. I started a conversation. As it turns out that the plastic mold, that is the cover, that is made in India. Right, the wire is made in India, the plug point is made in India. But the coil heater inside, the copper coil inside is imported from China. The grill is imported from China. Right, the motor is of course made in India, fortunately, but then the copper coil itself is not, right? So then I asked him, why is it that these items are being imported? He says that no small company in India actually has the capability to make those here. So we need technological, and for simple items, by the way, relatively simple items, we need technological extension. We need to create that cadre of MSMEs who are going to underpin manufacturing excellence. Because we have the big conglomerates, we have other things going for us. See, we already have the large industrial conglomerates that can provide the scale. They need the sort of industrial supply chain under their wings.
That's right. You've emphasized one thing that I think is really crucial for a developing or emerging market economy. The small and medium enterprises, I do some work on China, and there too, the need for small and medium enterprises, especially in the context of employment growth and innovation, is important. Now, big companies are very good at innovating, but there are small companies that start with completely greenfield ideas that are able to develop into conglomerates, and you need to have an economy that provides the space for that. So I'm glad you brought up that issue. It's a really crucial one for India. And that requires, a soft infrastructure, but also a physical infrastructure. And by soft infrastructure, and you talk about this in your book, having a good institutional framework, the rule of law, a financial system that works well, and so on, are crucial. But let's turn to geopolitics. Since we've talked about India's role in the world and how using its economic policies it can increase its strength. Now, where I sit in Washington, D.C., there is a particular way of looking at the world. When I go to European capitals, it's slightly different. And then you come to China, it's entirely different. As I travel around other parts of Asia, though, there is a sense of almost fear about whether countries should align themselves with the US and the West more broadly, or with China. Now, India has taken a very interesting position, not aligning itself too closely with these two sides. Now, I think your book points out that there are some positive elements to this, but potentially also some risks. What is the best way that India can position itself in order to benefit from this, not quite non-alignment, but multi-alignment that is forming, and manage the risks?
See, India is definitely better integrated with the, if there is a splinter net tomorrow, if the global internet splits into two, India will definitely find itself on the side of the Western Hemisphere because of existing interests, right, and existing connections. That is a given. The EU has started a technology and trade council with India. The EU, earlier, the EU had a technology and trade council only with the United States of America. So India is bringing certain strengths to the table, which is why, you know, the dialogue is happening. Even in that global, as far as the global, you know, AI initiative, the United States is very keen to partner with India in, you know, GPAI. It is very keen to a global partnership for artificial intelligence. Even the United States is very eager to have India on board that, right? And a lot of track 2 discussions between India and the West are underway in all these spheres, not just track 2. In fact, the Department of Energy sent a delegation recently to India, and they had a talk with the Minister of Science and Technology, and they discussed everything from quantum to new energy, as in, you know, alternative energy sources, alternative battery technologies, advanced cells chemistries, the works. Point is that India needs to invest much more in research and development. The thing is that even after seeing the entire world, the answer always lies within, right? It's a very sort of semi-mystical thing I'm saying, but the answer lies within. It is only on the basis of your own strengths can you interact in a way with the world that is going to be useful for you. But I definitely see India leaning towards the West. India is still dependent on China for one simple reason. India is dependent on China because of the supply chain. As given the example, you know, you can take recourse to the example I gave. So what has happened is, even as the Modi government has instituted these performance-linked incentives, which has led to greater output, say, of cell phones, and India now doesn't import more than 5% of its cell phone requirement, mobile phone requirement. But the value added of Indian mobile phones is still below 20%. We are dependent on the Chinese supply chain. We are dependent on active pharmaceutical ingredients from China for our wanted pharmaceutical sector. We call ourselves the pharmacy of the world, but we depend on key starting material from Chinese sources. So it is not surprising that as we've given a manufacturing push to at the processing level, at the end processing level, actual output, final output, our imports from China have gone up. Because we are importing a lot of machinery from China because we don't build capital goods here. And we are importing even more intermediate products, parts and components from China. So it is not surprising that our trade deficit with China is actually increasing. So that is the key risk for India. India will have to create its own supply chain. And India will lean towards the West. Because there is, I don't think, given China's own self-reliance perspective and the various non-tariff barriers it has erected to Indian pharma, Indian IT, and other things. I mean, if you look at India's exports to China, they're made up of primary commodities in the main. Right? It's primary sector exports. India's exports to China, not imports. Some machinery, but you still have iron ore going that way. You still have other primary sector items going that way. You have some cotton going that way as well. But we have to move beyond that. We have to develop our own strengths. And because we have extent strengths in IT and other things, and we are connected with the West, we can become that friend-shoring partner that the United States needs. The United States wants to break up its existing trade deficit with China into smaller deficits, right? With other partners with whom it is comfortable and with whom it will have we will have greater bargaining power as well for market access. But that can't really be 4 or 5 odd, discrete entities. They will still require scale because the one immutable law of manufacturing is economies of scale, and that has not changed. So I think India will lean to the West, lean towards the West.
Yeah, that seems like a natural alliance, although there have been certain complications over time. once upon a time, which I'd like not to think about too much, there was a man in the White House called Trump who used to think that bilateral trade balances were really crucial, and the fact that India had a bilateral trade surplus with the US ended up, I think, distorting US policies towards India. Some rationality is certainly returning there, and that is a good thing. Now, in your book, Saurav, you also talk about one element of economics that ties in very closely with geopolitics, which is a matter near and dear to my heart as well, which is that of currencies. Now, we see the major reserve currencies being the dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, the pound sterling, and a smattering of other currencies. The renminbi has been trying to make a play to be a more international currency. Where do you see the Indian rupee fitting into this? Do you see the rupee as having the prospect of playing a bigger role in international finance?
Of course, this is a question I should be ideally asking him because he's the complete bona fide expert in this realm. But yes, as a trade and settlement currency, surely. But till you open up your capital account, you really don't have a shot at becoming an asset class. Because if people can't, if it is unidirectional, that I can push money into an economy, but I can't really pull it out quickly enough, then there's no point. I mean, nobody is going to invest in a INR or RMB, which is not fully convertible on the capital account. But yes, as a trade and settlement currency, we are definitely going to see more internationalization, especially because of India's multi-alignment strategy, which requires India to trade with Iran and Russia. So those are going to be there, and messaging system will also be in place. For transactions, and equivalent to SWIFT will also be put in place. So that will happen, but definitely not as an asset, as a central bank reserve currency. I don't see the rupee taking off any time in the next 10 years or so.
Okay, so on the connection between geopolitics and economics, again, you've pointed out some of the complications in trying to create a closer alignment with the West while staying economically dependent on China. And this is true not just of a country like India, even Germany is in the same conundrum. What do you think is the best way for India to manage this balance between the economic relationship with China on the one side and trying to improve both the economic and political relationships with the West and the US in particular on the other side?
Yeah, well, India will have to decouple from China eventually. I have a very pessimistic view of things there because of the way, two empires sharing a common border is never very healthy, and it invariably leads to friction. And while this current sort of the so-called years of peace that we saw after 1975, because that was the last time shots were fired in anger along the line of actual control. That was actually the exception. That was not the rule, right? That was the exception. So given the issues of dependency, given the issues of resilience, India will decouple from China. This is actually the strongest hand that China has. India can, proscribe TikTok. It can sort of take on, force MG Motors to leave India. It can create trouble for Xiaomi. But that is not really going to ruffle the Chinese. But if the Chinese stop or, disrupt the supply chain, then India is going to be in a bit of a bother. In fact, this is their biggest hand in the sort of India-China dyad at the moment. And as far as China opening its economy, I don't see that happening. I see it going the other way, because they need to move into high-end services in a bigger way now. They also need to, what is happening? Samsung shuts its factory in China, moves out of China altogether, and a Chinese major takes over that factory. Right? So you're going to see consolidation in the Chinese space as well. And that will mean more barriers to trade, not less so. Right now, but of course, when the demographic decline really kicks in China, then China may have a different view of things in terms of it might become a net importer of a lot of things. I mean, finished products and stuff like that.
So there is time for a couple of questions. As you can see, Saurav's book goes over a vast swath of territory, and we could spend a lot of time talking about different parts, but maybe we'll just take a couple of questions from there and you can answer them together. And please keep it to questions, not statements. So you have a mic there. So one or two sentences, at least one of which must end with a question mark.
Okay, it's on, and I'll just hold you on to one thing, Saurav. You used the word granular, and that struck a chord with me because when you look at the data in terms of India, the numbers are not sticking. So when you're talking about 700 million Indians holding ration cards, there is no middle class trap yet. And then 200 million are in abject poverty. So if I look at it granularly, even in terms of the economics of it all, the whole story is somehow not sticking together. And even with the G20 and the Quad, very soon there will be things of the past. I mean, they just go away. There was the BRICS earlier, and nobody talks about BRICS anymore.
What is your question, please?
So the question is, all narrative is only a narrative for a certain period of time, but the granularity of it is, at the final analysis for India, is the numbers of 700 million which truly matter.
Okay,
Whether
got
we
it.
talk
Thank
of
you.
MSMEs, that's the question, and I think I've been very, very
Okay, let's take
clear
one more
about.
question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I just want to understand how have you evaluated India's position in the Russia-Ukraine war so far, in the context of this multi-alignment, multipolarity from both geopolitical and a geoeconomic.
Okay, let's take one more question, then you'll have 3 minutes to answer all of them.
Hello, sir. मैं देवेश. I'm just asking about geopolitics of India. Do you know we are second top exporter of refined product, refined petrol. So do you think it is a good initiative of India in global world, because world is facing for fuel at time?
Okay, so there are 3 questions, and I will also give you, given that we have 4 minutes left, the chance at the end to end with one really provocative thought from your book, because Saurav's book actually covers a lot of provocative ground, but what is the one thing that you are going to leave with your readers that makes them really intrigued? But maybe you can answer the questions about geopolitics and the couple of other things that came up, all in about 3 minutes.
Right. So see, India is a lower middle income economy. There is no doubting that, right? And there are several people who are below the poverty line, both by the national definition and by the global definitions that are there as well, in terms of earning 1.9, dollars per day, etc. But the point is that but it also has a very large neo-middle class, and of course it has a 1% that apparently owns, according to Oxfam, owns 40% wealth. The point is that India's internal market is large by any measure. India has definitely reduced poverty by any measure, even if you take multidimensional poverty over the last 20 odd years. The pandemic was a setback, and I go into that in great detail. Not just the pandemic, earlier shocks given to the economy in the form of demonetization and GST, the way it was implemented. I am also in favor of GST. But you can't have a 5-speed GST. You need, ideally, GST should have 1 slab rate, right? So, of course, that's the ideal, but whatever, that's debatable. So, the setback was there, and the point is that we were on a particular growth trajectory. The moment you have very large losses, say for even a quarter, you may move on to a lower growth trajectory. So the potential rate of growth for the Indian economy is probably closer to 6% right now. I'm talking about various estimates that I would give credence to, rather than the 7% that is usually assumed. This is real GDP growth, actual production, not nominal GDP. When you hear the $5 trillion target, you're talking about nominal GDP at current dollar exchange rates, right? So that is there, but manufacturing has to be put in play, has to be backed now because of what he said, because MSMEs are going to be the engines of the economy as far as employment is concerned. Unemployment is still hovering at dangerously high levels in India. It's still over 7%. Sometimes the CMIE data shows it's at 8%. So we have to go there. There's a long way to go, but you'll be surprised how quickly things can change, right? And regime change, what you talked about, is one of the points of this book, that regimes change. Obviously, this will not remain extant forever. And India of 2035 may have very different questions to answer. So it's not the same. That is the fundamental point about the book, that regime change is a fact of the world. The other question was about India's sort of positioning in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Well, it's all about capability. The fact of the matter is that the United States needs India. If the United States does not get another player who can manufacture at scale, inflation will become entrenched in the US economy. The world economy requires a new deflationary force. And that deflationary force for all these years was the Chinese worker, and will now have to be the Indian worker. Africa's turn will come at some point, right? of the African countries. Now, so in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what is happening? Why does India have a hand there? India is sought after by the West for being the key swing state in the world, for being a key market, for being a key provider of human resources that will determine whether the tech war will be won by the United States or not, vis-a-vis China. At the same time, India is also one of the greatest refiners in the world, right? Exporters of refined products. It is because we can refine that Sar Ural crude that we are being able to bring it into India. And it is being re-exported to destinations that I shall not name. So the point is that, so India is acting as a conduit in that whole setup. Europe is not going to be any better off if this thing lingers forever, because energy decoupling is going to be even more of a problem for them. Right? So India is playing its cards well over there, but India has to reduce its arms dependency on Russia going forward. And of course, industrialization is supposed to take care of that. What does industrialization do? It gives you the ability to build weapons. It creates a middle class that can consume and produce.
Excellent,
Right.
Saurav. That was a great summary of a lot of issues in your book. So please join me in congratulating Saurav on a book that is really very expansive, very intriguing to read. And I strongly recommend it to all of you, Negotiating the New Normal. And Saurav will be at the tent now to sign books if you would like to do so. Thank you very much, Saurav, for an intriguing discussion.
Wouldn't have done it
Thank
better.
you so much, Saurav and Eswar. As a mark of respect from the festival, please accept this. Thank you.
Dere